There was a moment, somewhere between 2011 and 2013, when federal investigators pulled up a dashboard on their screens and couldn't believe what they were looking at. Not because of what was there, because of how long it had been there. A marketplace, fully functional, encrypted, invisible to every conventional search engine on the planet, generating millions of dollars in revenue every single month, and operating by all available evidence, with almost no serious interference from any law enforcement agency anywhere in the world. The site was called Silk Road. And before this case is over, that name will mean something very different to you than it does right now. Most people who know this story think they understand it. Drug marketplace, dark web, guy gets arrested, case closed. But that version, the version that made headlines, that circulated on social media, that got turned into documentary segments and newspaper columns, that version is missing something. Not one thing, several things. And the things it's missing are the parts that matter most. Because Silk Road wasn't just a story about one man building something illegal. It was a story about how an entire digital ecosystem formed in plain sight, technically invisible but structurally audible if anyone had been listening carefully enough. It was a story about regulatory gaps so wide that an entire economy passed through them for years without triggering a single coherent institutional response. It was a story about a philosophy, a genuine, coherent, passionately argued philosophy that collided with federal law and left behind wreckage that nobody fully anticipated. And it was a story about what happens when the system tasked with stopping something like this is itself divided, distracted, and in some cases corrupt. That last part, that's the part most people skip. We're not going to skip it. Let's go back to where this actually starts. Not 2011, not when the site launched, earlier than that. Because to understand how Silk Road was possible, you have to understand what the internet looked like in the years before it. And more importantly, what law enforcement's relationship to the internet looked like at that same moment. The mid-2000s were a period of profound institutional confusion around digital crime. Agencies that had spent decades building expertise in physical surveillance, wiretaps, informants, physical stakeouts, were suddenly confronted with a landscape they didn't have the vocabulary to describe, let alone police. The FBI had cybercrime divisions. The DEA had electronic surveillance units. Homeland Security had digital forensics teams. But the coordination between those units was inconsistent, and the institutional knowledge about how anonymous online networks actually functioned was, by most internal accounts, deeply limited. Tor, the onion router, had existed since 2002. It was developed originally by the United States Naval Research Laboratory, designed as a privacy tool for intelligence communications. The technology worked by routing internet traffic through multiple encrypted relays, making it extraordinarily difficult to trace back to its original source. By the mid-2000s, Tor had been released publicly and was being used by journalists, activists, whistleblowers, and privacy advocates around the world. It was also, by that point, being explored by people with very different intentions. And here is where the first layer of this story begins to complicate itself. Because Tor was not a secret technology. It was not something that required specialized hacking knowledge to access. It was open source, publicly documented. The United States government had, in a very real sense, built one of the foundational tools that would later make Silk Road possible. And for years after its public release, federal agencies had no coherent strategy for monitoring, infiltrating, or even understanding the networks that were forming in the spaces Tor created. This is not an accusation. It is a structural observation. And structural observations are what this case is actually about. In 2011, a man named Ross Ulbricht launched Silk Road on the Tor network. He was 26 years old. He had a degree in physics from the University of Texas at Dallas and had gone on to study materials science at Penn State before leaving academia. He was quiet by most accounts, thoughtful, deeply interested in Austrian economics, libertarian philosophy, and the writings of economists like Ludwig von Mises and Murray Rothbard. He had spent years thinking about what a truly free market might look like. A market unmediated by government regulation, operating entirely on voluntary exchange, protected by cryptography instead of courts. Silk Road, in his conception, was not a criminal enterprise. It was an experiment. He gave himself a pseudonym, the Dread Pirate Roberts, a reference to The Princess Bride. deliberately chosen to suggest that the identity was a role, not a person, that whoever occupied that seat was enacting a character, not exposing themselves. The site launched in January 2011 with a small number of listings, mostly psychedelic mushrooms and some low-grade cannabis. The first public notice of its existence came in June 2011 when an article appeared on Gizmodo describing an anonymous online drug marketplace that accepted Bitcoin. The article spread widely. Within weeks, Silk Road's user base had expanded dramatically, and here is something that should stop you for a moment. Because in June 2011, a major technology publication ran an article describing, in relatively clear terms, how an anonymous dark web drug marketplace worked, what it sold, and how to access it. Senators Charles Schumer and Joe Manchin sent a letter to the DEA and the Justice Department demanding action. There were press conferences. There were statements. There was, by every visible indicator, a moment of acute public awareness that something significant was happening. And then, almost nothing. For 2 more years. Silk Road continued to operate. It continued to grow. It continued to generate revenue. By the time federal investigators had built a case substantial enough to act on, the site had processed an estimated 9.5 million transactions in Bitcoin, totaling somewhere between $1 billion and $1.2 billion in value, depending on how Bitcoin's volatile price was measured at any given point in time. $1 billion on a site that had been publicly identified by name in a major technology publication 2 years before it was shut down. That is the anomaly at the center of this case. Not Silk Road itself, not Ross Ulbricht. The 2 years, the gap, the space between identification and action. What happened in that space? Who was responsible for filling it? And why didn't they? To answer those questions, you need to understand how Silk Road actually worked. Because it wasn't just a marketplace, it was a system. A genuinely sophisticated system with internal governance mechanisms, a dispute resolution process, a reputation framework, and a set of explicit community rules. Understanding its architecture makes the failure to dismantle it earlier far more, not less, troubling. The technical foundation was straightforward by dark web standards. Access required Tor. Payments were made exclusively in Bitcoin, which in 2011 was still a niche technology known primarily to cryptography enthusiasts, libertarians, and early technology adopters. Silk Road did not accept credit cards, wire transfers, or any form of currency that could be easily traced. Every transaction passed through a Bitcoin tumbler, a service that mixed coins together, obscuring the chain of ownership and making it significantly harder to trace specific transactions back to specific parties. But the technical architecture was only part of what made Silk Road functional. The other part was cultural. Silk Road had forums, active, moderated, extensive forums where vendors discussed product quality, packaging techniques, and shipping methods, where buyers left feedback using a 5-star rating system, creating a reputation economy that incentivized vendors to deliver what they promised. Where the Dread Pirate Roberts himself posted regularly, writing long essays about freedom, voluntary exchange, and the philosophical underpinnings of what he was building. He was not hiding what he believed. He wrote openly about the site's purpose. He engaged with users about the ethics of anonymous commerce. He articulated with genuine intellectual effort a worldview in which Silk Road represented not just a marketplace, but a demonstration that consenting adults could transact without state interference, and that the absence of violence in those transactions proved something important about the nature of commerce itself. There is something unsettling about this, and it's worth sitting with it for a moment. Because Silk Road, whatever else it was, had almost no violence. The reputation system worked. Disputes were mediated, scams were penalized. Vendors who shipped bad product lost customers. The community self-regulated in ways that, by some academic analyses published after the site's shutdown, produced drug transactions that were in certain measurable respects safer than street-level drug purchases. Better product information, more accurate dosing guidance, less physical danger from face-to-face exchange. That does not make what Silk Road did legal. It does not resolve the question of whether a market in controlled substances can ever be ethically clean. But it does complicate the narrative. And complicated narratives are exactly what law enforcement agencies often struggle with. Because complicated narratives require institutional flexibility, and institutional flexibility is not what large federal agencies are designed to provide. By 2012, at least 3 separate federal agencies were running parallel investigations into Silk Road. The DEA had a unit working the case. Homeland Security Investigations had a separate team. The FBI had their own operation. These investigations were not, at least not initially, coordinating in any systematic way. They were, in some cases, competing. And that competition was about to make a bad situation dramatically worse. Here is where the case changes shape entirely. Among the federal agents assigned to investigate Silk Road, 2 would later be criminally charged, not for anything they did to dismantle the site, for what they did while investigating it. Sean Bridges was a Secret Service agent assigned to a task force working the Silk Road investigation. He had specialized technical skills in cryptocurrency and had become, by all accounts, a genuinely important member of the team. He was also, during the course of that investigation, stealing Bitcoin from Silk Road accounts. Not stealing from criminals in some morally ambiguous sense. Stealing in the most straightforward way imaginable, using his access to seized accounts to move Bitcoin into wallets under his own control, then converting it to cash. He stole approximately $800,000 in Bitcoin during the investigation. Carl Force was a DEA agent with even deeper access to the case. He had created an undercover persona, a character named Knob, to develop a relationship with the Dread Pirate Roberts directly. He was embedded in Silk Road's trust structure, and he was using that position to extort money from Ulbricht, threatening to expose his identity unless payments were made, while simultaneously leaking information about the investigation to Ulbricht himself, compromising the federal case he was supposed to be building. Force also created multiple additional undercover identities, used them to sell information to Ulbricht, and then, most extraordinarily, attempted to fake the murder of a Silk Road user Ulbricht wanted killed, while pocketing the Bitcoin paid for the contract. Read that sentence again. A federal agent assigned to investigate an online drug marketplace was taking payment from the site's operator to fake the assassination of one of the site's users, while simultaneously accepting money from that same operator in exchange for information about the federal investigation targeting him. This is not a peripheral detail. This is not background color. This is the second investigation. The investigation inside the investigation, and it reveals something the official narrative about Silk Road almost always fails to adequately address. The case against Silk Road was not a clean story of righteous law enforcement dismantling an illegal operation. It was a story in which some of the agents pursuing that operation were simultaneously exploiting it for personal enrichment. A story in which the corruption of the investigators themselves may have extended the life of the marketplace they were supposed to destroy. How much longer did Silk Road operate because Carl Force was feeding information to Ulbricht? The honest answer is, nobody knows precisely. What is known is that Ulbricht received warnings about specific investigative activities on at least several occasions during the period Force was embedded in the case. What is known is that Force's actions were discovered not by internal oversight, but as a collateral consequence of the investigation's eventual success. Investigators examining the evidence against Ulbricht found, embedded in that evidence, records of communications that should not have existed between a federal agent and his target. And this is where you have to ask a different kind of question. Not just, why did it take so long to catch Silk Road? But, what else was going on inside that gap? Force and Bridges were caught. They were convicted. They served prison sentences. The case, in terms of its official resolution, was closed, but the existence of 2 corrupt agents inside a major federal investigation raises questions about institutional oversight that the Justice Department's subsequent narratives around Silk Road never fully addressed. Were Force and Bridges acting entirely alone? Were there others whose conduct fell short of indictable criminality but nevertheless compromised the investigation? Was the interagency competition between the DEA, the Secret Service, the FBI, and Homeland Security creating blind spots that individuals like Force were able to exploit? These are questions without public answers, and their absence is itself a data point. Meanwhile, on the other side of the investigation, the man building Silk Road was making his own errors that would ultimately prove fatal to his anonymity. Ross Ulbricht, for all the sophistication of the system he built, made a series of mistakes that, in retrospect, feel almost paradoxical given the intellectual care he brought to Silk Road's architecture. He was meticulous about operational security in some respects, and careless in others that seem almost inexplicable. In 2011, before Silk Road launched publicly, Ulbricht had posted questions on a programming forum under his real name. Questions specifically about coding techniques that were later identified in Silk Road's source code. He caught the error quickly and changed his username to something anonymous, but the original post was cached. Years later, an IRS investigator, not an FBI agent, not a DEA analyst, but a tax investigator named Gary Alford working on the financial side of the case, found that cached post using nothing more sophisticated than a well-constructed Google search. This is the detail that unravels everything. A billion-dollar anonymous marketplace, encrypted communications, Bitcoin tumblers, multiple layers of operational security. And it was cracked, in meaningful part because of a forum post made under a real name, found by a tax agent using a standard search engine. The incongruity is almost too large to process, but it points to something important about the nature of operational security failures. They are almost never technical. The cryptography doesn't fail, the encryption doesn't fail. What fails is human behavior. The small inconsistencies, the moments of carelessness, the early decisions made before the full weight of what was being built was understood. Alford's discovery gave investigators what they needed to focus their attention on Ulbricht specifically. From there, the case moved relatively quickly. The FBI identified a server in Iceland that hosted some of Silk Road's infrastructure, obtained its data, and used that data to reconstruct significant portions of the site's activity. They found, in Ulbricht's own logs, a meticulous journal of Silk Road's operations, entries that were frank, sometimes disturbingly so, about decisions made, crises navigated, and the psychological weight of running what had become a massive illegal enterprise. In those logs, investigators found something that would become one of the most controversial elements of the case. Evidence that Ulbricht had arranged, or attempted to arrange, for at least 6 murders. The targets were individuals who had threatened him, extorted him, or knew too much about his identity. One of the cases involved the Knob persona, the undercover DEA agent Carl Force, who had been soliciting payment for contract killings while simultaneously receiving payment from Ulbricht for information about the investigation. Force staged the death of one target. The body, never produced because the murder never happened, was sent to Ulbricht as photographic evidence of completion. No murders were ever confirmed to have actually occurred as a result of any of Ulbricht's solicitations. The FBI could not establish that any of the contracts had been executed. When Ulbricht went to trial, the murder-for-hire charges were not included in the federal case. Prosecutors chose to move forward with the drug trafficking, money laundering, and conspiracy charges, reserving the murder allegations for potential sentencing enhancement. He was convicted on all counts in February 2015. The trial lasted 4 weeks. The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. 2 consecutive life sentences plus 40 years. The reaction to that sentence was immediate and polarizing. On one side, prosecutors and law enforcement officials who argued that Ulbricht had built the infrastructure for a massive drug distribution network, had solicited murders to protect it, and had shown no genuine remorse. The sentence, they argued, reflected the gravity of what Silk Road had enabled, not just sales, but overdose deaths, fentanyl precursors, and a model that subsequent dark web marketplaces would replicate. On the other side, civil liberties advocates, legal scholars, and a significant portion of Ulbricht's supporters who argued that 2 life sentences for a first-time, non-violent offender, even accounting for Silk Road's scope, represented a disproportionate application of mandatory minimum sentencing frameworks that had long been criticized as fundamentally unjust. They pointed to the corrupt agents. They pointed to the tainted investigation. They pointed to the philosophical coherence of what Ulbricht had built, even if they disagreed with it. His mother, Lynn Ulbricht, launched a public campaign for clemency that persisted for years. It attracted support from unexpected quarters: libertarian politicians, some criminal justice reform advocates, a subset of technology community figures who found the sentencing extreme. In January 2025, over a decade after his conviction, Ross Ulbricht was granted a full pardon by President Donald Trump. He walked out of prison after serving approximately 11 years. The pardon reignited every argument that the trial had generated. It added new ones. It became almost immediately a political flashpoint, with supporters framing it as a correction of an unjust sentence, and critics arguing that it trivialized the harms enabled by Silk Road, including deaths linked to substances purchased through the platform. But here's what the argument about the pardon often misses. The argument about whether Ulbricht's sentence was just is separate from the argument about what Silk Road revealed. And it's the second argument that is, for our purposes, more important. Because Silk Road did not emerge in a vacuum. It emerged from a specific set of conditions, technological, regulatory, cultural, and institutional, that allowed something of its scale to form and operate for years before any coordinated response materialized. Understanding those conditions is not about excusing what happened. It's about understanding what makes such things possible. The Tor network, the infrastructure that made Silk Road invisible, was and remains publicly accessible. It was not created for illegal commerce. It was created for privacy. The question of how a privacy technology gets weaponized and what legitimate oversight looks like in response to that weaponization without destroying the legitimate uses of privacy itself is a question that regulators, technologists, and legal scholars have been debating for over 2 decades without producing a satisfactory answer. Bitcoin, the currency that made Silk Road's transactions untraceable, was created as a philosophical and technical experiment in decentralized currency. Its pseudonymous ledger, the blockchain, is in many respects more transparent than cash. But in 2011, when Silk Road launched, the regulatory frameworks for cryptocurrency were essentially non-existent. The IRS had not issued guidance. FinCEN had not issued guidance. There was no coherent legal framework for what Bitcoin was, let alone how it should be monitored. The gap between when Silk Road launched and when federal agencies had the technical literacy to pursue it meaningfully was not primarily a failure of effort. It was a failure of institutional adaptation. Large bureaucracies adapt slowly. Technology moves faster than law. This is not a new observation. It has been a structural feature of the relationship between digital innovation and legal oversight since the beginning of the internet age. But Silk Road made that structural failure visible in a way that nothing before it had. After Silk Road was shut down in October 2013, dark web markets did not disappear. They multiplied. Silk Road 2.0 launched within weeks of the original's shutdown, run by former Silk Road moderators and vendors. Alphabay, Hansa, Dream Market, Wall Street Market, each generation more sophisticated, more distributed, more resilient than the last. The FBI, DEA, and Europol took down some of them. Others simply went dark voluntarily when the operators decided the risk had become too high, and new ones formed. As of today, dark web markets continue to operate. The technology has evolved. Some have moved to platforms beyond Tor. Some use Monero instead of Bitcoin, a cryptocurrency designed from the ground up to be untraceable in ways Bitcoin never truly was. The cat and mouse dynamic that Silk Road initiated has not been resolved. It has expanded. And the institutional failures that the Silk Road case exposed, the interagency competition, the susceptibility of investigators to corruption, the lag between technological development and regulatory response, the lack of coherent cryptocurrency oversight, those failures were addressed in piecemeal fashion. Some improvements were made. FinCEN issued cryptocurrency guidance. The IRS created a digital asset tracking division. Interagency coordination on dark web investigations improved significantly, producing takedowns that were more targeted and more effective than anything that happened during Silk Road's operational years. But the fundamental gap remains. Technology, by its nature, generates new spaces faster than institutions can map them. Every new layer of encryption, every new privacy tool, every new anonymization technique creates another set of edges that law enforcement has to understand before it can police. And in that gap, always, someone is doing something. What happened with Silk Road was not unique. It was an early, spectacular, and unusually well-documented example of a recurring phenomenon. A new digital space forms, a sub-economy emerges within it, And by the time the institutional response catches up, the space has been inhabited for long enough that dismantling it creates its own set of questions. Ross Ulbricht built something that was, by the standards of the law, unambiguously illegal. He facilitated drug sales. He may have solicited murders to protect his operation. He ran a criminal enterprise that, at its peak, was one of the most sophisticated of its kind in the world. Those facts are not in dispute. But he built it in a space that existed because a privacy tool developed by the American military had gone public. He funded it with a currency that existed because the regulatory frameworks capable of monitoring it hadn't been created yet. He operated for 2 years after being publicly identified because the agencies assigned to stop him were underfunded, poorly coordinated, and, in at least 2 cases, actively compromised by the corruption of their own agents. The $1 billion that passed through Silk Road was not hidden from the world. It was hidden from institutions that lacked the tools, the coordination, and sometimes the integrity to find it. And after Ulbricht was arrested, those agents, Force and Bridges, were caught and convicted. But their convictions were treated as a footnote. The dominant narrative was, Silk Road shut down, founder arrested, justice served. That narrative is comfortable, it has a shape. A beginning, a middle, an end. But it leaves several questions without answers. How much of Silk Road's extended operation was attributable to the intelligence leaks that Carl Force provided? How many investigations before and after Silk Road were similarly compromised by the specific corruption pressure that comes from agents embedded in cryptocurrency-rich environments with minimal oversight? And, perhaps most uncomfortably, if the pardon of Ross Ulbricht represents a political statement about the justice of his sentence, what does it say about the cases of the agents whose corruption helped keep him in operation longer than he might otherwise have been? Those questions don't have clean answers. They may never have clean answers, because the real inheritance of the Silk Road case is not the story of one man and one marketplace. It's the exposure of a recurring institutional failure. A failure of speed, of coordination, of oversight, of integrity, that the case made visible but did not cure. Dark web markets still operate. Cryptocurrency still outpaces regulation. Interagency coordination on digital crime is better than it was in 2011, but the fundamental asymmetry between the speed of technological innovation and the speed of institutional response hasn't changed. And somewhere right now, in a part of the internet that doesn't show up on any search engine, something is operating that 3 years from now will make headlines. That will generate Senate hearings. That will prompt urgent calls for action. And the question that will follow those headlines, the same question that followed Silk Road, will be the same one it always is. How long has this been going on? And why did it take this long to find it? That's the question Silk Road left behind. Not the one that was answered in a San Francisco courtroom in 2015. Not the one that was reopened by a presidential pardon in 2025. The one that's still open. The one that may always be open. Because the gap between what technology can build and what institutions can see isn't closing. It's growing. And whatever is in that gap right now, whatever is operating in the silence between capability and oversight, hasn't been found yet.